All right. Good morning, City. How are we doing? Yes, as you heard, my name is Duncan. I have the privilege of being on staff here at City. I didn't introduce myself, and I got called up by my wife in the 8 a.m. But this is the joy of multiple gatherings. You get to fix all the mistakes. So don't worry, you guys are getting the best version so far, because everything that was wrong in the 8, it's going to be fixed now. I'm just kidding. It's going to be good. All right, so if you don't know, if you haven't been with us for the last few weeks, we're in a series called the David Dialogues. And this is actually going to be our close of that series. This is week 9. And the whole idea around the series is we're looking at relationships, but specifically our communication within relationships. And we used David, a man in the Old Testament. We've looked at his life. And through that lens, we've been able to see different dialogues he had with different types of people. And through it, we've been able to get really tooled up in terms of our communication. And it's been a great series. We've heard countless stories of people really being affected and really equipped for everyday life through this series. Now, as I said, we're looking at communication. And I want to take you back to a concept that Glenn helped us get in the beginning of this series. Glenn isn't here this morning. He's preaching at another church, but I know he's thinking and praying for us. But he brought this concept to us that communication doesn't originate in our vocal cords. It actually originates in our heart. When the Bible talks about the heart, it speaks of the sum of all that you are. Your desires, your thoughts, everything that is you can be summed up in this concept of your heart. And from your heart flows everything. So all of our communication, how we interact with people, the thoughts we have, the things we say, the things we do, come out of the heart. So it's a pretty important thing to get right. And as we close this series today, I want to come at it with this thought. What we say in our heart, the dialogue we have within our own heart, has the potential to either set us up for distraction or victory. It's going to be good. I remember the story. I was 5 years old at the time. So most people think that's like 10 years ago because I look that young, but I'm not. It was 20 years ago. But, before the times of like a Nintendo Switch and stuff, back when we used to play TV games. But being 5 years old, we used to, at that time, with family friends, go to the farm. And I can tell you, I don't know what that place is called. It's just, to me, the farm. I can't. It's somewhere past Tabazimbi that way, and it's the farm. We went to it all the time. A couple times a year, we would go with family friends. And I remember one time we went. Some of you may know Ryan Sherry. He was in our evening gathering. He's now moved to Joburg. Just got married to Bronwyn. We were really good family friends back in the day when we were that little. And they had come with us to the farm. And so there's the two of us, little 5-year-olds, joined by our younger siblings, brother and sister, that are like kind of 2-3 years old at the time. And it was late afternoon at the farm. The parents had very responsibly taken a late afternoon nap and left the kids to their own devices. And there used to be this outdoor fire area. So it had rocks and concrete, and then some bushveld kind of grass, and some dry trees. It was always good fun to play around the outdoor fireplace. At this time, while the parents are sleeping, there is a little fire going at the outdoor fireplace. And there are little kids playing with said fire. You can see where the story is going to go. We had got a hold of some paper plates, and we're seeing if we could burn them and then save the paper plate and try to see how it would all work. And then we would get braver. And so as we got braver, we took 3 paper plates and we threw them in the fire. Just threw it in willy-nilly. And suddenly there was this massive gust of wind, and it changed everything. Because as these paper plates began to burn, they suddenly exploded out of the fireplace. And with everything around, high grass, dry trees, we froze. Even as 5-year-olds, 2 or 3-year-olds, we knew what this meant. And it's probably the earliest, most vivid memory I have. I remember just in that moment saying in my heart, this is how 5-year-old me dies. And in that moment, it's funny how you can react. The other 3 reacted, as many can imagine, in pure fear, screamed and took off running back down the hill towards the parents to safety. 5-year-old Duncan took another approach. He saw this as a moment for him to be a hero. And I can just hear like some African-American preacher in my head, like, there's going to be a moment when the fire is blazing and you're going to have a choice. Are you going to run or are you going to stand? You could go into, I'm telling you, there's a whole preach there. I don't know where that came from. See, I make mistakes in the 10 as well. But I chose to stand my ground and be a hero. And so I saw the first paper plate. It was not too far from the fire. And I rushed over to it and kicked it back into the fire. And it worked. And I was quite chuffed with myself. I had got confident. And when I reached the second paper plate, that confidence quickly was quenched because I then decided not to kick it, but rather to pick it up with my hands. And 5-year-old me didn't understand that that meant that I was going to be in a lot of pain because I got burnt. But in my terror, I threw it back into the fire. And now came to the third one, but this thing was moving. The wind was going, and all I saw was grass. And as it was going, I had learned from my mistake. I saw a stick, and I dived with the stick and pinned it down to the concrete and let the paper plate burn out around the stick. At this time, 2 dads are coming belting up the hill, going crazy, red in the face, stressed. But it was okay, because the sight they came to was a 5-year-old Duncan standing very proud, the hero that saved everyone at the farm. Little did they know that my hands were so sore that I just wanted to cry in that moment because it had burnt me proper. But have you ever had one of these moments where you said in your heart, okay, this is it. It's tickets. This is how I die. You suddenly see eulogies of people, like, what are they going to say about me? Because this is it. This is the moment. You say it in your heart. And this is the place that we find David in. We're going to be in 1 Samuel 27. And at this time, David is still a fugitive of King Saul, much like last week as Side looked at Abigail. He's a fugitive. He's on the run. He's in his own country, but he's fleeing from cave to cave, from nook to cranny, hiding from the king who sought to kill him. At this time, he'd actually had 3 chances to kill Saul, but he had spared him. But we find David in a dark place. He had been facing major opposition, and it had been a long time. It was a trial that had gone on for some time, and it didn't look like it was going to end anytime soon. And so we find David in 27. We'll start in the first verse. It says this, "Then David said in his heart, 'Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair, seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand.' So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Moach, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household." Lord, I want to thank you so much for your word. I want to thank you that you are a God who speaks to us. And Lord, we get to see these stories and these accounts of mighty men of God. And ultimately, you have something to say to us. Just as you had worked in David's heart, won't you even now work in ours? Won't you make this real to us? Won't you bring it alive? Lord, we want to see you lifted up in this place. And everybody said, amen. So the question I have for you is, what have you said in your own heart? Have you ever taken a decision, made a choice within your own heart, and then where has that led you? Maybe it was in or out of a job. Maybe it was in or out of a new relationship or a relationship that needs to end. Maybe it was something as drastic as moving cities or moving countries. Where did it lead you? The longer you go through life, the more you realize how one decision can vastly change your path. It can take you onto a completely new way of going. I have so many people that I speak to or I've walked a journey with where they say things like this, well, I feel like I'm in trouble right now. I feel like I'm spiraling down out of control, and I don't know what's happening. And it's funny, when someone is in that situation, if you push them enough, if you get enough info out of them, you can normally trace it back to a moment. to a decision, to something that they said in their own heart that set them on this path. Because our choices lead us somewhere, and it can sometimes get us in trouble. So as we look at this and David's choice that he makes here, we're going to look at another choice he makes a little bit later on, a couple chapters later. But I want to look at it under the two big ideas. The first idea is this moment where David has what I'm going to call a heart selfie. And then there's going to be a second one where you get to see David's heart restored. But let's get into this first one. Now, if you follow my wife on Facebook or Instagram, any social media, you will know that you don't need to scroll very far before you will hit a selfie, and it's going to be perfect. It will be a great angle. The lighting is going to be amazing, and it's going to have just the right filter to get all them likes. Maybe like that beauty filter, but it's maybe down on like a 3 because she doesn't need much, just a little bit to get it to pop. But selfies are a real thing. I think Nikita's given up on this and chose to do selfies because she knows I can't take a picture that's good enough to make her Instagram because the quality just doesn't make it. But we see selfies all over our social media, whether it's on Facebook or Instagram. And the idea of it is that you have taken the responsibility on yourself. You are going to be the one that does this as an individual on your own, no outside help, no inquiry. And what David does in his heart here is he leaves God out of the dialogue. God isn't mentioned at all. He's not inquired. David takes a heart selfie. And I want to ask this question. What happens when we do not inquire of God? What happens when we leave him out of the equation? As we look at David's heart selfie, I think there's a couple of things I just want to pull out. The first one is David's choice. He chooses to run. He chooses to flee. He chooses to escape, to get out of there. But I want us to understand the gravity of the decision he had made. He had chosen to leave and abandon his country. It was a traitorous act. There's no other way to look at it. But there's a warning in there that even David, who the Bible calls a man after God's own heart, even that guy can be so driven to this because of a trial, because of opposition that he has faced. Everybody, Glenn Campbell is in the house. He just snuck in the back, and now I'm going to give him a hand. Thanks for coming, Glenn. I'm just kidding. How was your preach? Was it good? Mine's going great. Nah, I love Glenn. Where was I? David was driven to this. And then not only was he fleeing this situation and abandoning his own country, but now he's actually going to the enemy, the Philistines. Do you remember Goliath? Philistine. That's who he's running to. It gets a bit crazy. Because I would love to ask David, did he really think it was a better option? Did he really think that this somehow was going to be safer? Did he really believe that, hey, God's protected me so far, but if I go beyond the borders, God's protection will follow me there? Was the grass really greener on the other side? And I think for us in Joburg and being South Africans, that's a question that resonates with us. Is the grass really greener on the other side? See, he was in a place of fear. He was scared of Saul. But hadn't God promised him the kingdom? His men had grown weary. There was no new recruits. But hadn't God brought them safe thus far? See, because the truth is, fear does funny things to our heart. And scared people can do very stupid things. They forget what's important, and they can ignore what is obvious. And they can shut off any outside help. And I want to ask us today, do we have any fear in our heart? Is there a situation, is there a selfie moment that's going on in you right now? Because there's something you are so fearful of, it's leading you to this place. I want to encourage you, do not let your fear be the wall that keeps God out. See, because a heart selfie has a danger. It can lead us into a place of disobedience. And that disobedience is against God. Also, with a choice always comes an effect on our character. One unwise choice can start to take you down a downward spiral that will lead you to destruction. And this was David's spiral. His character began to slip. We see he has to make a deal with an enemy. In verse 5, he says, "Then David said to Achish, 'If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of our country towns that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?' So that day, Achish gave him Ziklag." Let me tell you, there's a whole story in Ziklag. I wish I could get to it, but I don't think we have the time. So he has to make a deal with an enemy. And an enemy, in essence, is someone that's opposed to you. They're not going to have your best interests at heart. It's probably not a good idea to be doing. But suddenly he's making deals. And then once he's made these deals, he has to keep up the appearance, and he has to do that by lying. Verse 8 continues and says, "Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. When Achish asked, 'Where have you made a raid today?' David would say, 'Against the Negeb of Judah, against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites, and against the Negeb of the Kenites.'" He starts raiding the enemy people. And when the enemy king comes and says, who have you raided today? He says, no, the people of Israel, my people. He has to lie to keep the appearance going. His character begins to slip. Verse 11 continues and says, "And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, 'So David has done.' And Achish trusted David, thinking he has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore, he shall always be my servant." Remember, I said enemies are opposing. They're not going to have our best interest at heart, and Achish definitely didn't have that. But David had to keep lying to keep the ruse going. He had to be so harsh as to not leave anyone alive to take word back to the enemy king as to what was really going on. His character began to slip. And sacrificing character, who we are, what we believe in, how we act, is a sad but very real product of a heart selfie moment. You made the choice and you feel like you now have to stick with it no matter what. You can imagine the situation of a CEO or MD taking over a big company, and economic times are tough, and they have a heart selfie moment. This thing is going to die on my watch. I need to do something. And so, across the company, they institute cost-cutting measures. Everyone's going to be on board. We're all cutting. But then they have a meeting down in Cape Town with other CEOs from different companies, and they find out they're going to be on the same flight. And so they take their assistant aside. "Listen, just book me a business class seat. These guys are watching. We need to keep up the appearance. But we'll keep it quiet. We'll keep it between us." Suddenly the decision, even a good one, has gone to a place that it was not intended. Our choices and our character are always going to be closely connected. David didn't have God in the equation. Because let me tell you, when God is in the equation, when God is in the conversation, when God is in the dialogue, our character is always able to keep up with our choices. When He's not, our choices can quickly lead our character to a place we did not intend or did not want it to go. And because of this choice, and because of the slipping character, the spiral continues, and David faces consequences. 3 chapters later, I'll fill you in. In the meantime, David had tried to join the Philistine army in battle against his own people. Probably not a good idea. But sovereignly, he gets rejected by the Philistine generals at the time and gets sent back to his town in the countryside, only to find tragedy has struck. Verse 3 says, "And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep." The spiral continues, and eventually, the spiral reaches its rock bottom. Everything his choice had been searching for, safety, provision, community, gets taken away. well, in one fell swoop. Ziklag gets burnt. Their supplies are gone. Their family is taken. And cherry on the top, even his own men turn against him. Verse 6 says, "And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul." He reaches rock bottom. He's on his own. His men are talking of stoning him. Again, there was great fear. Fear makes us do funny things. They wanted to stone their leader. He was at rock bottom. But here's the good news. Even though we may stuff up, even though we may have these heart selfie moments where God is not in the equation, even though things might spiral down and spiral out of control, God's grace not only meets us in that place, it is actually the only thing that has the power to raise us up out of it. Because remember, God is in the business of bringing light out of darkness. He's in the business of bringing peace in the midst of chaos. He's in the business of allowing us to be made low so that He can raise us up. He's in the business of bringing good out of evil. I'm reminded of Genesis 50 and Joseph's words when he says, "What man has meant for evil, God has meant for good." Sometimes we need to endure the worst so that God can bring out His best. This was David's heart selfie moment. It was a choice he made. It had a slip in his character and ultimately led to a consequence he did not want. Our choices are the things we have control over. The consequences, sometimes we don't have control over. We just have to deal with them. But then we get to see David's heart restored because he makes a different choice. Verse 6 continues, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." Where God was absent before, He is now present. And the heart selfie has taken a back seat. See, because David's error was that he had forgotten who he was and whose he was. He had forgotten that he was a called man, that he was loved by God, chosen by God, protected by God. Glenn spoke about this trap that we can fall into a couple of weeks ago when he looked at David and Saul, the difference between a called man and a driven man. He had fallen into the trap of being driven instead of being called. When you're driven, it's all about you. It falls on you. It's your choice. It's your strength. And suddenly it can crumble down. He had slipped into this. But he needed to remember what he was, who he was, and whose he was. So he makes this godly choice. He strengthened himself in the Lord. I just want to quickly pick out that phrase. What does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? First of all, let me tell you what it's not. It is not based on our strength. God's grace, God's presence doesn't work like that. It's a gift that is given to us. It's not something that's earned. It's not about our activity, or it's not about our strength. It's also not passive. It's not some waiting game that we just receive. There is a pursuit. It's also not some sort of self-help, some cheerleader mentality, some positive way of thinking that's going to change things. It is actually the strength of God, the living God, the creator of the universe, and it is available to us. That's what it's not. Let's look at what it is. I think the first step of being strengthened in the Lord is acknowledging our weakness and the need for His ultimate strength. There's almost a discovery or a rediscovery of our identity in Him. The process for David happened alone. Now understand, we're in a community where we're called to stir each other up. The Bible says we should stir each other up to love and good works. But in this time, David was alone. He was isolated. He was away from his country. His family were gone. The men that he loved so dearly and they followed him had turned against him. It was at this point, almost his loneliest, that he gets strengthened in the Lord his God. And there's actually something beautiful about that moment. Because the problem was in David's heart and David's heart alone. He didn't get raised up by a new relationship or a new venture or a new way of thinking. It was by God Himself. And there's power in that. Because the issue was in David's heart and David's heart alone. He had forgotten who he was and he forgot whose he was. See, because sometimes we can run to others, we can run to advice, we can run to a change of scenery when sometimes all we need to do is turn back to God himself. See, because his strength is not like our strength. It's not just working hard in the gym and hitting a new personal best and going, wow, look how strong I am getting. That's not how it works. Because his strength is limitless. It's endless. And it's available to us. The second step is bringing close to your heart that which was far away. And it's the promises of God. David's called by God. God had promised him, you will be king. Israel will be yours. Saul's kingdom and his reign won't endure. You, your men, your house will go on. Those were the promises he had. But when David fled, those promises were very far from his heart. It's why running looked like a good idea. But when we get strengthened in the Lord, just as David would have been, he would have been reminded of his calling. And most importantly, the one who did the calling. God had brought David through safe thus far. And he is going to be the one that completes the work. Then the third thing is, again, receiving God's grace. And we do that with a heart of thanksgiving. A couple of months ago, we were in a series called Even When. And we were looking at the power of praise and how in changing our perspective in praise of God, when our eyes go above circumstance, it gives us a position of power. And I think when it comes to gratefulness and thankfulness and thanksgiving in our heart, it brings power into us. Because so many of our spirals, so many of the trouble we get ourselves into, whether it's through choices or simply just through sin, have a space where ungratefulness is reigning, where there's a lack of thanksgiving. You can imagine the situation of a husband or wife who has an affair. In that space, there is a lack of thanksgiving. There is an ungratefulness. Everyone can see what this person has in their spouse, except them. And this lack of thanksgiving leads them down a road that they did not intend. A heart of thanksgiving for what God has done and what God has given us can work like a shot of adrenaline to the weak heart, to the heart that's down and in a dark place. So we get this godly choice coming out of David to be strengthened in the Lord. But then he turns to the Lord and inquires of him, and we get to see a different set of consequences, and it's actually God's purposes. Verse 8 says, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. David sets out after the enemy with his 600 men in tow. And then there's this random little moment, and I just want to highlight it because it's going to become important for us going forward. They get to a brook, a river, and 200 of the men are so exhausted that they cannot go on. So they leave them at this brook, and David and his 400 carry on. Now you're looking at this situation. David is going with 400 men. That's less than he normally has. They're clearly all exhausted. They're going after an enemy that they have little to no intel on. The battle strategy seems a bit weak. But remember, he has strengthened himself in the Lord. He's inquired of God. God is in the equation. God is in the conversation. God is in the dialogue. And I'm reminded of Isaiah 55, verse 8, where it says this, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God doesn't do it like we would. His ways are higher, his thoughts are higher. And what looks like a weak battle strategy plays out with a very different set of consequences. Chapter 30, verse 11 continues and says, they found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate, and gave him water to drink. And David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I'm a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. And David said to him, will you take me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I'll take you down to this band. So he swears and takes him down. And verse 17 continues, and David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. How different a set of consequences when we inquire of God. When He is in the conversation, when He is in the equation. See, the absence of God led David down a path of a spiral of destruction. But now, he comes to a place of victory. Everything gets restored and more. The victory brought a huge spoil. His wives are safe. His family is safe. His men are happy. They've worked. It's all come back full circle. So we had a godly choice. We see God's purpose is outplayed. My question is, what happened to David's character? Before, his character had slipped. He had lied. He had to keep up appearances. But what happens now? David and his men are heading back with everything that had been restored. And it was huge. There was great joy. But then they reach the brook where the 200 men were left behind. And the Bible says, and they call it a couple of worthless men in David's camp protest this and say, these 200 should not share in the spoils that we have because they were not the ones that fought this battle. And David's character gets restored. Just as he had shown some charity to a random Egyptian, he now shows a different type of character. He says in verse 23, with a heart that has been restored, but David said, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Here's where I want to land. David knew who had won the battle. And I really believe this truth set him up for the rest of his life to become a great king in Israel that would be spoken of for centuries. He knew who won the battle. The battle is the Lord's. And I want to ask us today, this morning, as we sit here, do you know that in each one of our hearts there is a battlefield? And my question is God going to be on the battlefield? How can He be if He's not even in the equation? Because we're going to fight battles in our heart. We're going to have to dialogue. Choices are going to have to be made. But is God going to be in the conversation or not? Are we going to include Him in the dialogue or not? Because if David's story has shown us anything, it's that it can go one of 2 ways. Either it's going to be a spiral of destruction where God isn't inquired and it's all on you and you have to wheel and deal and your character's going to have to probably slip to keep up the appearance and stick with the choice. And eventually you reach rock bottom and it's going to all crumble. Or is it going to set us up for a place of victory where we get strengthened in the Lord, where we are called people of God, where we're loved by Him, where His promises are kept close to our heart, and thanksgiving flows out of what God has done and what He has given, and where our character gets to be found in the grace of God and ultimately gets to be extended to others. I don't know where you find yourself. Maybe you're in a place where there's a little bit of fear that has crept in. And just like David, you're wanting to flee. You're wanting to run. You're wanting to escape. Is God on the battlefield? Have you inquired of Him? Have you let yourself be strengthened in Him? Because it gets real. When we're scared, we can do funny things. The obvious becomes very muddy to us. And sometimes the wrong decision can lead us down a spiral of destruction. If there's anything David is showing us here in this dialogue with his own heart, it's that the heart selfie needs to die. I wrote it on my notes at the top of every page. No more heart selfies. Because that's what I want you to hear this morning. Too many times we go to our hearts alone. And we fight that battle on our own. And too often we're going to lose. But when God is in the equation, when He's on the battlefield, it changes everything. He gets put on show. He wins. He restores. And through that, through His grace, we get to win. Why don't you stand with me? Lord, I want to thank you that when you come after us, you come after our whole being. It's why it's why your gospel goes after our heart. It's why your word says that you get to swap out a heart of stone that's spiritually deaf to you, and you get to put in a heart of flesh. It's because you knew that our heart is our whole being. And if you can get to that, it will change everything. Jesus, again, you are going after our hearts. We may know you. We may have walked a road with you. But there's some stuff that we might be excluding you from. There might be some fear that are putting up walls that are keeping you out. Lord, you're calling us back to be a people that inquire of you, that are strengthened in you. Lord, there's no more heart selfies. That can't be a thing for us. Lord, won't you again declare your promises over us? Won't you again bring the good news close to our hearts? Lord, and as we sing now, won't you be just dropping where we need to be looking, where we need to be inquiring. Lord, you're a good God and you have good things for us. And you bring restoration in its fullest. Let's sing.